Welcome to the main selection this week. We're going to be reading a story called Rocks in His Head by Carol Otis Hurst, illustrated by James Stevenson. The genre this week is a biography. A biography is a story of a real person's life written by another person. As you read, think about how this author is connected to the person she wrote about. Okay, so a biography tells a story of a real person's life, their talents or achievements. The story is usually told in chronological order, which means in order of when the events happen. So biographies will start with when the person is born and then go through their life. In autobiography, now it's different. I've got biography and autobiography. Autobiography is written by the person whose life is described and uses words such as I and me. So an autobiography, if I were writing my life's achievements or talents or about my life and I was the author of that story, that's an autobiography. I would talk about my achievements using words like I and me. Like I am a teacher, okay? An biography is written by someone else and uses words such as he, she, him, and her. So we are going to be reading this story, this biography about a man. I want you to look at the title, look at the picture. What can you predict this story is going to be about? Okay, well, looking at the title, Rocks in His Head, I'm wondering if that actually means he had rocks in his head or what the meaning of that title is. And I can see that he's looking at something pretty colorful, and I'm guessing that he might collect rocks. Okay, question of the week, why is it valuable to have unique interests? So I'm also thinking, okay, if he collects rocks, that's his interest. How does that benefit him in his life? What happens because of this interest that he has? All right, let's get started with our reading. Some people collect stamps. Some people collect coins or dolls or bottle caps. When he was a boy, my father collected rocks. Okay, I'm going to go back to the previous question when we were in the genre. What is the connection of the author to the person in the story? Did you catch it? Let me read it again. When he was a boy, my father collected rocks. So the author of this story is writing a biography about her dad. When he wasn't doing chores at home or learning at school, he'd walk along stone walls and around old quarries looking for rocks. People said he had rocks in his pockets and rocks in his head. He didn't mind. It was usually true. When people asked what he wanted to be when he grew up, he'd say, something to do with rocks, I think. There's no money in rocks, someone said. Probably not, said my father. When he grew up, my father decided to open a gas station. People called them filling stations then. My grandfather helped him build one on Armory Street in Springfield, Massachusetts. They called the station the Antler Filling Station. My father carefully painted the name right over the doorway. Inside the filling station was a desk with a cash drawer, which my father usually forgot to lock, and a table for his chess set. My father built narrow wooden shelves on the back wall and painted them white. People said, what are those shelves for? He said, I've got rocks in my head, I guess. Then one by one, he placed his rocks and minerals on those shelves. He carefully labeled each rock to show what kind it was and where it had come from. In those days, lots of rich people had automobiles, but Henry Ford came out with the Model T. And we are reading about Henry Ford right now and his invention of the Model T. That was a car many people could afford. My father had taken one apart and put it back together again and again until he knew every inch of the Model T. He thought that anyone who had spare parts for the Model T and could repair it so that it drove like new would do a good business. So he was not only a filling station where people came to get gas, he was also able to fix the Model T. That's a pretty valuable skill to have because that gave him more business. He bought some parts from dealers and found some parts in junkyards. Okay, first, let's look at page 96. I'm going to go back up to the fourth sentence When he wasn't doing chores at home or learning at school, he'd walk along stone walls and around old quarries looking for rocks. What is the meaning of the word quarries? What context clues or clues in that sentence can you find to tell us what that word might mean? Okay, well, quarries must be places in the landscape that are filled with rocks, like mines or pits where workers dig out valuable minerals. Okay, so he would go to old quarries looking for rocks. So that must be a place where different rocks were. Okay, opinion. On page 97, can you find the opinion on page 97? It's going to be in the second paragraph. I'm going to give you a second to locate that. He said, I've got rocks in my head, I guess. How is that an opinion statement? Well, it is an opinion statement because I can see the word guess. And I've got rocks in my head, I guess. That's how he feels about what he has up in his brain all the time. Now, I want you to think about that. Do you think he really has rocks in his head? Like actual rocks? No, I don't either. I think what this might mean is that he thinks about them all the time. So much that they're always up there. He's thinking about them, talking about them. He had a display in his gas station of rocks. And I think it's a positive meaning because I feel like rocks were very important to the author, to the person in this story. He didn't really have rocks in his head, but they were very important to him and he thought about them all the time. Okay, the pile of Model T parts sat just to the left of the lift. Soon that pile of parts was bigger than the filling station. People said, if you think people are going to buy that junk, you've got rocks in your head. Maybe I have, he said. Maybe I have. But people did come to buy that junk. They came to buy gas, and they came to play chess, and they came to look at rocks. You can see some of his rocks that he had. He had turquoise, azurite, and malachite. Now, malachite is a very pretty stone. It's green and it's got different lines of green in it. And I've had a few pieces of jewelry made out of malachite. Okay, let's look at the statement. If you think people are going to buy that junk, you've got rocks in your head. Now, we've been talking about a positive meaning of that statement, that he's always thinking about rocks and that they're important to him. But this meaning doesn't sound as positive. What do you think people were implying when they said, if you think people are going to buy that junk, you've got rocks in your head? What do you think? Yeah, I think it might mean that possibly they thought that he wasn't very smart or that he was dumb to think that people would want that junk. Was he though? No, absolutely not. People did come to get the parts for the Model T, and they came to get gas, and they came to play chess, and they even came to look at rocks. For a while, my father was too busy for the chess games. He was pumping gas, changing tires, and fixing Model Ts. Where did you get this one? A customer would say, holding up a rock. Found it in a slag pile in New Hampshire, he'd say. Or traded for it with a fella from Nevada. Gave him some garnets from Connecticut. People in Nevada and Connecticut collect rocks like you do, people would ask. Lots of folks have rocks in their heads, said my father. He'd dig into his pockets and take out a rock. Take a look at this one. Then the stock market fell. At first, people didn't think it would matter much to my father. After all, he had no money in the stock market. I have rocks in my head, he said, but I think bad times are coming. And bad times did come. People couldn't afford to buy new cars or fix their old ones. When business was slow, my father would play chess with some of the customers. When business was very slow, my grandfather would mind the filling station, and we'd pile as many of us kids as would fit into our Model T, and we'd hunt for more rocks with my father. Okay. All right, so we've got a cause and effect relationship on page 99. So the stock market crashed, which was where a lot of money was held, and it crashed, which means that the money that people had was no longer available. Like banks didn't have money, people didn't have money, it was hard to buy food, it was hard to buy necessities that people needed. So what were some effects of the stock market crashing? What was the result? Well, people stopped coming for gas. People couldn't afford to fix their cars anymore. What effect do you think this would have on his gas station? Okay, I think you're right. I think something is going to happen. He had to build more shelves for the rocks up the west wall of the station. Then people stopped coming for gas. They stopped coming to play chess, and they even stopped coming to look at the rocks and minerals. They were all too busy looking for work. So the gas station started to have effects of people not coming. Do you think that he's going to be able to survive in his business if he's not going to have customers? I think you might be right. One day, my father picked up the chess set and carefully packed it in a big box. He took down each mineral, wrapped it in newspaper, and carefully placed it in a wooden box. I feel like the rocks were very special, and I can tell that because how carefully he's wrapping them and putting them away. When his friends came with a truck to help us move, they said, "Watch out for those wooden boxes. He's got rocks in his boxes now." "Yes, sir," said my father. "That's just what I have got in there. Take a look at this one." The house we moved to was old and falling apart. My father said he'd have it fixed up in no time. But before he started on the repairs, we had to take those rocks up to the attic where he'd already built tiny little wooden shelves. My father did fix up the old house, and after he finished each repair, he went up to the attic with his rocks. He spent a lot of time reading about rocks too. "If you think those rocks are ever going to do you any good," said my mother, "you've got rocks in your head." "Maybe I have," said my father. "Maybe I have." He reached into his pockets. "Take a look at this one." My father spent a lot of time looking for any job he could find. Most jobs lasted only a day or two. On rainy days, when my father could find no other work, he'd take the bus to the Science Museum. They had a whole room full of glass cases containing many rocks. Sometimes he'd spend the whole day there. Okay, let's look at these 2 pages. All right, I see in the text that the father carefully wrapped and packed each rock. He also built shelves for the rocks. I know that when people are very attached to something, they treat it with great care. I can decide or infer then that the father's rocks collection was very important to him. And I'm also reading too that he has rocks in his pockets all the time. Not only is he thinking about them, but he actually has rocks and he asks people to look at them. The narrator says, the people stopped coming for gas. What conclusion can you draw about the father's filling station from the statement of fact? So the filling station did actually stop getting customers. Well, I can conclude that the father's filling station is no longer doing well, and we've learned that it actually closed. So what would cause the father to go to the Science Museum? On page 101. Well, if he couldn't find work for the day because there weren't a lot of jobs available, he would get work for maybe 1 or 2 days. He would, on the days where he couldn't find work, he'd go to the museum. What was he looking at the museum? Right, they had cases and cases of rocks. And since we know that's his keen interest, that's probably where he spent most of his time. One afternoon, he looked up to see a lady standing beside him. "I've seen you here before," she said. "I come here a lot," he said. "I guess I've got rocks in my head." "Tell me what you're looking for," she said. "I'm looking for rocks that are better than mine," he said. "How many did you find?" she asked. 10, he said. The lady looked around at the hundreds of rocks in all those glass cases. "Only 10? Maybe 11, he said. He smiled. She did too. Okay, so if there are hundreds of rocks and he only found 10 or 11 that were better than his, what can you conclude about that statement? Right, I can decide that he probably has just as many rocks as he's finding in that museum. He must have hundreds of rocks in his attic on those shelves that he built. You have got rocks in your head, she said. I'm Grace Johnson, the director of this museum. These rocks have come from all over the world. So have mine, said my father. He reached into his pocket. Take a look at this one, he said. Did you study rocks at college, she asked. Couldn't afford to go to college, he said. Let me see the rest of your rocks, she said. Okay, so he knows a lot about rocks, but he never went to officially learn about them. How do you think he gained all that knowledge about the different rocks that he owns? Well, it did say earlier in the selection that he did research, so he would read about rocks all the time. Mrs. Johnson got out of her big Packard touring car, and my father got in. They drove to our house. Where are the rocks, she asked. Up here, said my father, leading the way to the attic. Watch your step. 2 hours later, Mrs. Johnson said, I can't hire you as a mineralogist. Sorry, boys and girls. The board won't allow it, but I need a night janitor at the museum. Will you take the job? Will I be cleaning rocks, he asked. Sometimes, she said. So my father took the job as night janitor at the museum. Before he went home, he'd open some of the mineral cases and scrub some of the rocks with a toothbrush until they sparkled like diamonds. So a mineralogist is a scientist that studies rocks. She couldn't afford at the time to hire him, but she did get him a job in the museum. So because of his interest in rocks, it landed him a job, which was really important during those days because there were not a lot of jobs available. Mrs. Johnson came in early for work one morning and saw him carefully writing a new label for one of the rocks. What are you doing, she asked. One rock was labeled wrong, he said. I fixed it. Mrs. Johnson smiled. I've been talking to the board of directors. They know that I need a person here who knows as much about rocks as you do. What about the college education, he asked. She said, I told them I need somebody with rocks in his head and rocks in his pockets. Are you it? Maybe I am, said my father. Maybe I am. Curator of mineralogy. He reached into his pocket and took out a rock. Take a look at this one, he said. So in the end, how was the interest he had in rocks helpful? Right, he actually ended up working in rocks. He didn't start out working in rocks because he had to make a living and support his family. But in the end, he was able to put his interest to good use, and he became the main scientist in mineralogy at the museum where he was working as a janitor. Okay, very last page here. Talent with a twist of the tongue. The phrase rocks in his head is a play on words. Now that means that rocks in his head isn't really meaning that he's got rocks in his head, but it is a play on words. So he didn't have rocks in his head, but he was thinking about rocks all the time. So really, that was always on his mind or always in his head. Tongue twisters are also a type of wordplay. People all around the world enjoy these playful verses, and they exist in every language. Below are 3 well-known tongue twisters. As you read, think about what makes this language playful. Okay, I don't know if you've ever done any of these tongue twisters. I used to be pretty good at the bottom one. So you can take some time to practice this page and read each of these tongue twisters and see if you can get faster and better at them. So I'm gonna give them a try right now. You can try it with me, and then you can try it on your own. Try to say these 3 tongue twisters as fast as you can. Okay, let me get ready. All right, she sells seashells by the seashore. The shells she sells are surely seashells. So if she sells shells on the seashore, I'm sure she sells seashore shells. Whew, that was a tough one. Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled peppers. Did Peter Piper pick a peck of pickled peppers? If Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled peppers, where's the peck of pickled peppers Peter Piper picked? Whew, that was a little bit better. Let's try the last one. How much wood could a woodchuck chuck? If a woodchuck could chuck wood, he would chuck he would as much as he could, and chuck as much wood as woodchuck would if a woodchuck could chuck wood. Whew, now you give it a try. All right, I am on this page because I want you to look at the Meet the Author and the Illustrator, Carol Otis Hurst. Rocks in His Head was Carol Otis Hurst's first book. It is the true story of her father. He collected rocks from the time he was a small boy. He kept at it throughout his life, not caring that others thought it was a waste of time. And it ended up, in the end, not being a waste of time. Miss Hurst says her father loved to learn new things. He'd be thrilled to think kids at school were reading a story about him. James Stevenson has written and illustrated more than 100 children's books. More than 30 of them have won awards. He wrote his first children's book when he was 8 years old. "Tell me a story and we'll make a book," he told his son James. "He stood at my desk and told a story. I wrote it down and then did the pictures." They called the book "If I Owned a Candy Factory." It was published in 1968. Now, these two books listed below are more biographies. Beethoven Lives Upstairs by Barbara Nickel, and Snowflake Bentley by Jacqueline Briggs Martin. I'm going to include these read-alouds for you to check out, and Snowflake Bentley is really appropriate for now since it's winter and we just got some snow. All right, boys and girls, I hope you enjoyed the story. Keep reading, and I will see you later this week.